Throughout the 21st century, we've seen many smartphones, and there have been a good few spectacular devices released that have stood as iconic and beautiful pieces of technology, like the iPhone 5 or the Samsung Galaxy S8, and then you have phones like the Kyocera Echo, which is maybe not quite as iconic. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and for every well-designed and meticulously crafted smartphone, there's about 100 more that are not so well-designed, and so today we're gonna go through the top 25 ugliest and most poorly designed smartphones ever made. So at this point, I've done a few of these top 25 lists, including the worst smartphones ever and the weirdest smartphones ever, and my one rule is that I can't reuse any of those phones that I've already talked about. Now, this is kind of problematic because, as it so turns out, a lot of the weirdest and worst smartphones ever also just so happen to be the ugliest. But that's okay, because it means we get to look into some more obscure devices that maybe you haven't seen before. Sure, I would love to, talk again about the Energizer Power Max 18K Pop. I think I got that name right. Or there was like the Nokia 7600. That was a pretty ugly phone. But even without those, I think we have a pretty entertaining list here today. Now, of course, this is all very much subjective, and so you'll probably disagree with some of the phones on this list, and that's okay. You're allowed to be wrong. No, but honestly, this is all in good fun, right? And a lot of these phones aren't necessarily ugly, as they are just poorly designed. Maybe they include some sort of feature that just butchers everything else, and so you'll see as we get along. But without too much further ado, huge shout out to the Discord server. You guys are the absolute best. The boys over there helped me out with some of the phones on this list, which was very much appreciated. Make sure you come join the community if you haven't already. And yeah, hit that like button, and let's get started with number 25. Kicking things off at number 25 from 2008, we have the HTC Dream, also known as the T-Mobile G1. Nothing like starting off with a fun but no doubt controversial pick, and I really can't tell if this design is ugly or cool. Maybe both. I do have a soft spot for these slider phones. But in any case, if you don't recognize this phone, it is in fact the first Android smartphone ever. Yes, this is what the first Android ever looks like, and in my opinion, modern Androids should clearly be taking notes. Okay, but seriously, there is a lot of reason to dislike this design with a thick bottom bezel that has the 3.2-inch screen slide up on the left side to reveal the landscape keyboard. That bezel also kind of sticks out, with this phone having a more classic phone banana sort of shape, which is a bit odd, but not uncommon in HTC phones around this time. Using this phone in landscape with the keyboard, you'd have to kind of crane with your right thumb to get over that huge side bezel and awkward button layout, which actually included a clickable trackball used for scrolling and selecting. This phone does have a touch display though, but clearly they weren't ready to fully embrace the touchscreen quite yet. Personally, I never liked those trackballs on phones, but at least we don't have a stylus, so I suppose one step at a time. While this phone is sort of awkwardly shaped, what it really lacked was the simplicity of iPhone. You had the single home button, no physical keyboard, a big display. It was straightforward, simple, and was committed. The HTC Dream was trying to appeal to both the new style of smartphones as well as the old, and the result was a really mixed bag that received really mixed reviews. Android still had a long way to go before catching up to Apple, but this was a very important step in creating competition in this new evolving market. And hey, things could only get better from here, right? At number 24 from 2007, we have the Samsung SCH-i760, an overly convoluted name for a clearly overly convoluted design. At first glance, I don't really hate it, but when you start to look at what is actually going on, the confusion does quickly set in. If you enjoy having as many input options as possible, oh boy was this ever the phone for you. Not only do we have a sliding QWERTY keyboard, separate dial pad, this whole navigation button setup, but you also have the 2.8-inch 240p touchscreen and a stylus, plus a whole bunch more buttons around the device. Powered by Windows Mobile 6, this was a heavy hitter for smartphones of the time. It just so happened to have the unfortunate situation of being released the same year as the iPhone, which of course, had like one button on the front. The back of this phone isn't too bad, if a bit boring, featuring a 1.3 megapixel camera, and the device as a whole is very bulky. Also, what's with the font for this dial pad? Why are all the characters skewed like this? And I understand why you have the letters on the keys as well, so you can type the old-fashioned way by hitting the numbers multiple times, but why would you ever do that when you have a sliding keyboard? This is an interesting phone and kind of cool looking in a weird way, but the design is a mess, as it just tries to do too much in this weird in-between era of the pocket PCs of old and the modern smartphones of new. Not great, but certainly nowhere near the worst design that we'll see. Also, I love the CNET review for this, where their main complaints include the lack of a built-in scroll wheel, because clearly what this device needed was another way to interact with the phone, obviously. At number 23 from 2010, we have the Acer Liquid E. And in particular, I can't help but highlight the Ferrari edition, which exists for some reason and feels like an egregious affront to the eyeballs. Without the Ferrari edition, you've still got a really basic, plasticky, cheap-looking phone with a chunky build and huge, thick bezels. It's got a dedicated camera key for the 5-megapixel shooter that feels awkwardly placed on the upper left side of the back. It kind of looks like they couldn't decide if they should put the sensor in the middle or in the top corner, so they compromised and did both, and it's just not right, man. The 3.5-inch 480p touchscreen is surrounded by those huge black bezels and plastic frame, and you've got this very rounded top and bottom but still kind of sharp corners, which gives the phone a distinctive shape. Shipping with Android 2.1, Acer would generously give the Liquid E a full single update to Android 2.2 Froyo, which in fairness is actually more support than most phones got back in 2010. Apparently actually using this phone was a huge pain, as the display, while pretty sharp for 2010, was really unresponsive when it came to the actual whole touchscreen part of things. Definitely not a big deal, I'm sure. And of course, we have that Ferrari edition for some reason. Who thought this was a good idea? That bright red glossy plastic just looks ridiculous. Can you imagine holding this phone up to your ear in public to make a call? You would definitely turn heads, but probably not for the right reasons. As for how this collab even happened, it turns out there's a whole Acer Ferrari sub-brand that was formed back in 2003, mostly resulting in some laptops and a few monitors. You also had a Ferrari edition Acer Mini Liquid, which was a phone I almost included instead of this one, but I did determine it was ever so slightly better looking than the Liquid E thanks to the centered camera. At number 22 from 2012, we have the Samsung Galaxy S3, a phone most definitely designed for humans, as Samsung's slogan prominently lets you know.
Samsung Galaxy S3, designed for humans.
Okay, so I heavily debated including this phone, and I already know there's going to be anger in the comments because, you know, a lot of people actually owned this phone, but the reality is the sentiment towards this device's design has historically been very negative on the internet. While personally, I kinda like it for some reason, it is easy to see why a lot of people wouldn't. The tiny home button looks cheap, the overly curved corners are kind of awkward, and while the big AMOLED screen was gorgeous and ahead of its time, it had a lot of heavy lifting to do for this phone. The glossy white plastic isn't exactly ideal, it looks cheap, the whole thing looks cheap, and the vaguely metallic looking plastic frame isn't helping anything. The other colors have this brushed metal look despite still being plastic, and while it's not ideal, I probably still wouldn't have included this phone, no matter how cheap it might look, no matter how much the design may not be great, except there's a brown version of the Galaxy S3. Yes, a brown S3. Did anyone buy this? Who bought this? Why would they buy this? Are they okay? Should we send them help? Why did they design this in the first place? Maybe that's the better question. The Samsung Galaxy S3 was revolutionary and one of the most influential Android devices ever made, along with the best-selling. But in terms of design, Samsung still had a long way to go. Yes, I do kind of like the S3's look. I did a video on it not long ago, but there's a reason a lot of people remember this phone as pretty darn ugly. At number 21 from 2003, we have the Palm Trio 600, and oh man, yet again I can feel the anger emanating from the comment section already. Look, there's no question, this is a legendary phone, and it comes from a different era, one long before iPhones. Well, you know, 4 years before iPhones. Is this an ugly smartphone? By modern standards, sure, but for the time, it was sort of slick, even though it was big, chunky, and had this awkward antenna sticking out, but like, for this blend of personal digital assistants and mobile phones, it was very impressive, and the design itself wasn't too out of place at the time. Still, I can't help but feel this style of device has certainly not aged well, and I'm using this phone here as an example to mostly represent what I would call the era of pre-iPhone smartphones. There are some standouts here and there, but mostly you've got a lot of similar looking phones that tend to be very gray and very boring with way too many buttons, just like the Palm Trio. I've actually got here a Palm Trio 650 and 700, but there isn't too much difference in design. This form factor has been compared to holding a bar of soap, and I would say that's about accurate. It is really chunky. Running Palm OS, the functionality here was quite robust and the keyboard was very beloved by its users, but sticking this phone in your pocket and bringing it around would definitely have been a pain, especially with that big antenna sticking out. Honestly, I think that element of the design is easily its worst. It makes the phone look even more antiquated than it already is. Overall, these devices did have a ton going for them, but they were never super attractive smartphones if we're being honest. Shout out to the BlackBerry 7230 of the same era, which some might consider ugly, but I'll say it, I think this design is awesome and you can't convince me otherwise. In the very least, I would take it any day of the week over the glossy gray plastic that plagued a lot of other early smartphones. At number 20 from 2012, we have the LG Optimus View. An odd duck with this 5-inch display at a 4:3 aspect ratio, along with this stylus that had to be carried separately. Apparently, there was no slot for it in the phone itself, and I mean, it's pretty big, so that makes sense, but like, yeah, who's gonna bring this around with them anyway? By 2012, phablets were already getting pretty, well, big, and perhaps LG thought they could get ahead of the pack by making their phone wider rather than taller. You know, the exact opposite direction smartphone design would ultimately head in, because it's uncomfortable to hold. Sure, the phone was slim, and the 5-inch display wasn't bad per se, but it was still uncomfortable to hold. This phone is just so boring looking, even if you can forgive the weird form factor, which I can't, by the way. From the front, it's pretty basic. Capacitive navigation buttons, thick black bezels, standard enough. The back features this textured plastic that sort of resembles leather, but most definitely wasn't leather, and apparently felt quite cheap in the hand. And you've got this weird logo by the 4G LTE wordmark that might have you actually think this is a Windows phone, but no, it ran Android 2.3 Gingerbread. Don't forget, the Windows logo when this phone came out looked a little bit different. Again, there was no slot for the stylus, which was called the Rubberdium Pen. Am I saying that right? It's a dumb name anyways. But yes, no slot for the stylus, which is somehow even dumber than the name itself. But what we do have is an included TV antenna. Very necessary inclusion there. This phone was clearly an answer to the Galaxy Note, but it wasn't a good answer. All in all, one of the most boring, weird, and unnecessary designs of any smartphone ever made. But props to LG for trying something different, I guess. At number 19 from 2019, we have the Sony Xperia 8, another phone with a weird aspect ratio, but this time a 2:1 6-inch display with no notch, a big top bezel, and a small bottom bezel, and just a really weirdly ugly design in general. It's giving me TV remote vibes. The black one, honestly not too bad in my opinion, but the colors that include white bezels are just atrocious and unforgivable. It doesn't look right. It's too tall, and while I can appreciate having a small bottom bezel at a time where basically every Android device had a huge chin, it feels pointless when the top bezel is so thick. This phone was exclusive to Japan, and I can at least appreciate the variety in colors, even if those white bezels are indeed horrible. The hardware here itself was pretty typical for a 2019 Android running Android 9 Pie, all powered by the Snapdragon 630 chip and 4GB of RAM. The back of the phone isn't too ugly with this glossy glass and dual camera setup in the upper middle. It's really the asymmetrical bezel that bothers me, and in combination with the weirdly tall shape, I can't help but feel this design just doesn't work. Again, I can appreciate Sony being a little bit creative here and trying to avoid the notch, but as a package, the Xperia 8 just looks off. At number 18 from 2011, we have the Sharp FX Plus, one of the most boring and generic slider phones I've ever seen. I promise, I don't have anything against slider smartphones per se. There's a certain charm to these types of phones, plus they're super fun to play around with. The Motorola Flip Out that I looked at in a previous one of these top 25 videos in particular is probably my all-time favorite implementation of this, not because it's any good, it isn't, but because I can't stop fidgeting with it to this day. Even so, the reality here is there's a reason these slider phones died. It just doesn't work with the modern smartphone format. You're always making concessions to include that keyboard. The build had to be bulkier, the display probably had to be smaller, there was just less room to cram everything in, and even phones that did it better were just never an ideal experience, hence why you don't see these anymore. The Sharp FX Plus is a more rounded version of the 2010 Sharp FX, which I almost put in this list instead, but I ultimately decided on the 2011 version, if only for the fact that it came out for 2011 instead of 2010 a year later. While it looks maybe a little bit more comfortable to actually use, it's just so dang boring and generic, with this tiny 3.2-inch 320p screen, huge bezels, and a chunky black plastic build. For 2011, even as a budget phone, this just wasn't cutting it. The Sharp FX Plus isn't anywhere near the ugliest phone on this list, but it probably is one of the most boring. At number 17 from 2007, we have the Samsung Upstage, one of those phones that kind of only barely can qualify as a smartphone, but it does have internet browsing capabilities, so we're running with it. This is a very small phone, not dissimilar from like an iPod Nano, with two sides offering two very different modes of function. On the front, or is it the back, you've got a small LCD screen and a typical dial pad you would see on any standard candy bar phone of the time. Flip it over, however, and we see that 2.1-inch LCD screen and media controls, and you'll need to press a button every time you flip it over to tell the phone which side you're using. The idea here is you basically have an MP3 player on one side and then a normal phone on the other. While this phone isn't necessarily the ugliest thing that's ever existed, it's way too complicated and completely unnecessary. This came out the same year as the first iPhone, don't forget. It was an interesting idea, sort of, but one that felt completely pointless and annoying in practice. I mean, do you really want to have to be constantly flipping your phone over to switch from media or email to actually using the thing as a phone? And when you wanted to search for a song or type anything, you would have to navigate the software on the music player side, then flip the phone over, type in, say, the name of the song, and flip the phone back to see the search results. Definitely poor design, and absolutely deserving of making this list, even if it's sorta cool in a weird, quirky way. At number 16 from 2010, we have the Dell Aero, one of the plainest and just most boring Android smartphones I think anybody has ever made. At first, this phone really doesn't look so bad. We've got a rounded design with really thick black bezels, and for 2010, you know, a relatively sleek device by Android standards. It was light and fairly thin. Side note, I hate how phones used to throw carrier logos on the device itself, but it was very common practice, so anyways, old Android phone, nothing too out of the norm, right? On its own, this generic looking design probably isn't that worthy of making this list, but here's what's really awful. While there's no navigation buttons on the front bezel, and that kind of gives it a cleaner look, there's also no digital navigation bar. You see, the navigation buttons are on the side of the phone. Typical Androids from 2010 might have a set of 4 buttons: home, menu, back, search, and all of these were relegated to buttons on the sides, with the key below the power button acting as both the back button as well as the home button on a double press, and then on the right side you had another button that worked as the menu key and could also activate voice commands on a long press. This is so unintuitive, and while you could absolutely learn and get used to it, not having an obvious home button on the front of the screen would inevitably lead to confusion and a lot of awkward navigation by its users. Also, Dell's Android skin here is just ugly, even by Android 1.5 standards. Just all in all, an unattractive package, and one of the worst designed smartphones of all time. At number 15 from 2007, we have the E10 Glowfish X800, one of the many personal digital assistant / cell phone hybrids from this era, but I felt the X800 in particular stood out as notably unattractive. You probably haven't heard of E10, or at least I had never heard of them, but they were an electronics manufacturer based out of Taiwan and made a number of phones throughout the 2000s until Acer bought them out in 2008 for $290 million US. The Glowfish X800 had 3G networking, something the 2007 iPhone didn't have, but it also looked like this, while the iPhone looked like that. Yeah, the iPhone kind of made everything look bad in comparison back in these days, so you can't really judge this style of phone too harshly. What really gets me is the button layout and the way the colors clash and how chunky everything is, plus that orange wallpaper with the old UI of Windows Mobile. It's just too busy. It is touchscreen, or you can use the little joystick, and you might prefer that given the screen is inset, making actually using your fingers potentially a nuisance, but of course you've got the stylus as well for added precision. There is both a rear-facing and front-facing camera, which was pretty ahead of its time actually. iPhones wouldn't have a selfie camera for like 3 more years. Honestly, part of me loves this design, but I do think it's ultimately ugly. Earlier Glowfish models were a lot cleaner looking, and I think just having a single color on the front really works better. All in all, the X800 is a cool phone, just also ugly. At number 14 from 2006, we have the Samsung P300, probably my favorite design on this list thus far because I kind of absolutely love it. Yes, this phone technically fits this list since it does have internet capabilities, which is my own personal criteria for what makes a smartphone, and yes, this thing does look like a calculator, not a phone, and it's so amazingly awful that it's absolutely brilliant. This phone was ridiculously tiny, about the size of a credit card, and it was crazy thin for the time. It features a silver front panel and this black top part that held the speaker. On the back, we've got this really funky two-tone look and a 1.3 megapixel camera. There was this leather case with a secondary battery that the phone actually plugged into, probably because the main battery must have been so small to fit in that thing, and it kind of looked like a wallet case with this front flap that apparently was very annoying when trying to hold the phone up to your ear. Clearly Samsung was having some fun with this phone and very much intentionally leaned into the calculator look with the general layout and even the keypad. Problem is, on most phones this was not the standard keypad layout, meaning you would be retraining yourself to actually try to use this thing regularly. Not that you would probably want to do too much on the tiny 1.8-inch color display, which actually looked pretty good for 2006. Though, you know, you actually could do a good few things. There was a basic web browser, some Java games, an MP3 player, and standard utilities like a calendar, clock, voice recorder, and even, of all things, a calculator if you can believe it. I love this phone. It's amazing and I want one, but realistically it's a terrible design for a quote-unquote smartphone, and I do think it's deserving of this list. Maybe calling it ugly isn't the right word, but the prospect of having to actually type anything out on one of these is definitely an ugly idea. At number 13 from 2018, we have the Google Pixel 3 XL. From the back, this is actually a really gorgeous phone in my opinion. I've always loved the Pixel 3 design with the top glossy glass and then the matte frosted glass finish below, this two-tone look that just screams of class with some really nice color options to boot. But then you flip that larger Pixel 3 XL to the front and everything falls apart with the most infamous ugly notch ever made on any mainstream smartphone. It is bad. Really, really bad. Here's the thing, the iPhone X in 2017 first brought their notch along with the thin, symmetrical bezel bezels around the rest of the device. A lot of Android competitors the following years would try to mimic this to varying degrees of success, but they still typically had larger chins and notches that just never looked quite right compared to iPhone. While the notch was never ideal, it did make sense, since typically with just a bezel at the top, you were sort of wasting space anyways. You might as well put the time up there. Just make sure the notch doesn't, you know, cut too deep into the screen. Well, somewhere along the line, Google completely lost the plot and made this monstrosity. Not only do we have this huge honking chin, but that notch, man, it's not that wide, but it cuts into the screen so deep. If your notch is going to be this tall, you're now using space that should be reserved purely for content, because even a normal top bezel wouldn't be this big. Plus, it looks ridiculous and kind of like a face. I really don't know how Google overlooked what everybody else in the industry seemingly saw. Maybe they just wanted to stand out? You could tell they were embarrassed about this thing too. If you watch the original presentation, they really take their sweet time to show an angle of the front that actually displays the notch. Sure, dual selfie cameras are sorta cool or whatever, but there was no winning when you had to cut out this hilariously awful. Absolutely one of the worst designed and ugliest smartphones of all time, and it's honestly a shame because the rest of the phone was genuinely pretty great. Alright, break time. I've got no sponsors today, but this video took me a long time to make, so I'd appreciate a like if you haven't already. Maybe subscribe if you know, are into tech stuff. That would be cool. Maybe leave a comment telling me how stupid I am for some of the choices on this list. I mean, you're probably right to be real, so. Honestly though, these top 25 videos when I can't reuse phones I've already talked about, like, it makes it quite difficult. If you look up lists of the ugliest smartphones or whatever, if you can actually find lists for this, because it's shockingly not that much of a talked about subject, you'll probably mainly find phones I've already discussed. There are 50 of them, so I guess that makes sense. Did want to give a shout out though to phones that didn't make this list, including the really obscure smartphones of the world. Temu level phones, really cheap Androids, iPhone clones, plenty of those devices are extremely ugly. Phones that include fake camera lenses, those exist. Pretty much any Android phone from like 2018 to 2019 with a notch, those were all basically ugly. I mean, not like Pixel 3 XL ugly usually, but still pretty ugly. And just to reiterate again, a lot of these phones, not necessarily ugly per se, but just poorly designed. Like the Samsung P300, I want one, it's beautiful, but at the same time, I don't know if I'd want to use one, if that makes sense. But anyways, that's enough stalling. Let's get right back into this with the top 12 most poorly designed and ugliest smartphones of all time. At number 12 from 2009, we have the HTC Magic, the second Android phone ever made, which saw the physical keyboard dropped, but still lacked full commitment as HTC threw in a bunch of buttons and a trackball of all things, yet again. I've put this phone lower on the list than the Dream because honestly, I kinda like the look of that phone for some reason, I don't know why. But this one, man, it's just ugly. This cheap glossy plastic kinda gives me Galaxy S3 vibes, and then there's the thick curved body, too many buttons, the trackball, the old Android interface. There was a lot of promise and innovation here still, but it was in a cheap feeling ugly package and one that just wasn't at the point of competing with iPhone yet. Again, what was desperately missing from these very early Android devices was simplicity. This many physical buttons shouldn't have been necessary, but thankfully the software itself was quickly getting better as both Google and HTC were starting to find their way to properly competing with iPhone. While this is, in my opinion, a very unattractive phone design, we can't understate how important these devices were to the smartphone industry. I mean, without them, Apple may not have ended up with any actual competition, which is always going to be vital to further push innovation and change. This is certainly not some premium gorgeous work of art that has stood the test of time and aged perfectly. I mean, I've got it on this list for a reason, but ugly or not, these early Androids deserve a lot of respect for laying the groundwork for the future. At number 11 from 2004, we have the Nokia 7710. Oh, you didn't think we would get through this list without a Nokia phone or three, did you? Of course, there's actually plenty of old Nokias that could easily fit here, but I've already talked about a bunch of them in past videos, and you would think that might leave us with table scraps, but luckily, the Nokia 7710 is plenty ugly enough to slot right in at number 11. It almost looks like more of a game console than anything else, with awkwardly shaped buttons and controls on the sides of the landscape device, with an included stylus for the touchscreen. Yeah, touchscreen. Pretty impressive for 2004. That 640 by 320 16-bit color 3.5-inch LCD actually has a 2:1 aspect ratio, which is kinda cool, and you had a full 1-megapixel camera on the back. Ultimately, this, like a lot of Nokia phones of the era running Symbian OS, had a lot of cool ideas and innovative features, but lacked the refinement necessary to bring it all together as one cohesive package. It's also just goofy looking, got that classic taco shape, N-gauge style. That awkward shape and size just didn't make sense for users looking for a phone back in 2004. Plus, no physical keyboard here, and while that actually was ahead of its time as it so turned out, it was also considered a bit of a downside for your average busy businessman who might otherwise be interested. While there's a certain charm to these old Nokia phones, I think it's hard to argue that it isn't deserving of being on this list. Oh, and shout out to the Nokia 7700, which was basically the prototype version, and may or may not have actually released. Some sources I found say it was cancelled and never released, some say that it was sold for about 6 months or so until mid-2004, but in any case, the 7710 was definitely more popular, and it's hard not to see why they wanted to refine things. That 7700 looks ridiculous, although I guess the 7710 didn't exactly turn out great either. Still a cool phone though. At number 10, from 2016, we have the Siren Labs Solarin, a luxury smartphone with an emphasis on privacy. While it may not appear that ugly initially, although I'm really not a fan, you have to keep in mind this is from 2016, and it would cost you an absurd $15,000, or around there at least. From the front, the phone looks typical enough, although those big bezels and the chunky build aren't doing it any favors. But then flip it over and, well, things don't exactly get better. We've got a titanium frame and leather backing, which I wouldn't necessarily mind, but then there's that weird camera setup. It just looks off, and the way the top and bottom edges of the phone are rounded is so unappealing to me for whatever reason. I also just don't know if I'm really a fan of leather phones. I didn't hate the LG G4, shout out to the brown G4, that phone almost made this video actually. I don't mind the black one though, so ultimately it didn't. In any case, when you have an expensive phone like this, they like to add the genuine leather because, you know, it sounds expensive. The reason for this upside down teardrop camera setup is actually underneath the camera you've got a switch. Specifically, it's a security switch, and when turned on, you have an enhanced security mode that was apparently supposed to encrypt messages and lock down any and all personal information by restricting both the hardware and software capabilities of the device. So if you were about to send some sensitive data somewhere, hit that switch first, do your thing, then hit the switch again to get back to the normal mode. On one hand, this phone was clearly for a very niche market that can not only afford a phone like this, but actually might need one in the first place. But on the other, I find it difficult to believe the security here was anywhere near good enough to be worth paying $15,000 for a mediocre at best Android smartphone in 2016. It's ugly, uninspired, and clearly made to exploit those with money to burn. So I would say it's absolutely worthy of making this list. At number 9 from the year 2000, yeah really the year 2000, we have the Motorola V100, also known as the V.Box. At some point it gets difficult to determine where the line is between what qualifies as a smartphone and what doesn't. But for these videos, my general rule of thumb is this: does it connect to the internet with any sort of browsing capability? If yes, then heck, I'm gonna call it a smartphone. And this very fun looking Motorola V.Box from the year I was born thusly does technically qualify. It's probably closer to a pager/phone hybrid, but by the year 2000 standards, this thing was extremely advanced despite its, well, fun appearance. Right, so this looks like a children's toy? Seriously, from the colored translucent plastic to the font on the buttons and the little monochrome display, it's really difficult to imagine anyone old enough to drive actually using this thing unironically. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would totally use a phone like this because it's clearly awesome. Could you imagine if Apple made like a translucent plastic iPhone? I would buy that immediately. But yeah, the phone is ugly, just in the best possible way. The clamshell design, the full QWERTY keyboard, the wireless application protocol browser that could display WML formatted websites, heck, what's not to love? Oh, and there was also apparently a green version of the V-Box, which is somehow even worse. This truly might actually be the most 90s phone ever to exist, even if it did come out in the year 2000. I really want one. I might try to find one of these on eBay. At number 8 from 2017, we have the Nokia 3310, not the OG mind you, which was definitely not a smartphone, and was also capable of withstanding the force of 1,000 atom bombs, but we're looking at the retro throwback version that Nokia came out with to try to drum up nostalgia. While this phone is certainly quirky, and I can appreciate what Nokia was going for by bringing back the old aesthetic of one of the most iconic cell phones ever made, the reality is, for a 2017 smartphone, this is just an ugly device. Yeah, maybe that's the whole point of it, but doesn't change reality. Rocking a 2.4-inch 240p full-color display, classic dial pad and navigation buttons, colorful plastic shell, mind-boggling 2-megapixel rear camera, and even Snake built in, what's not to love? For a 2017 dumb phone, this was a fine enough device. And we are calling it a smartphone for the sake of this list because, you know, internet, and there's some basic capabilities like social media included, but all in all, I just can't help but feel this is such a lazy phone. Yeah, nostalgia's great and all, but that display with the rounded black bezel just doesn't look quite right to me. I feel like if the screen had maybe rounded corners, it would look better. I don't know. But even with that, this is just, it's too far out of place to be considered a good-looking phone by 2017 standards, iconic or not. I'll be darned if it doesn't have some charm, especially with I like the orange one, I think. But yeah, the 2017 3310 really never needed to exist, though I'm glad it does, if only for the sake of it being a mildly interesting footnote in smartphone history. At number 7 from 2017, we have the VTech Kitty Buzz. Okay, hold on, hear me out. Yes, this is a phone made for children, and technically it's not really a smartphone since it only has Wi-Fi connectivity as far as I can tell, but you know, it's sort of a smartphone and we're gonna call it one. Okay, this is definitely the most we've cheated so far on this list, but come on. In case you haven't noticed, it is in fact incredibly ugly. Now, as a phone for kids, I suppose you can't expect a Johnny Ive tier design or anything, and what we get here does make sense, you know, for children. You've got thick plastic with rubber bumpers along the top and bottom for no doubt frequent drops, an inset touchscreen, and this obnoxious orange ringed camera that can flip to be front or rear facing. We even have two color options, a boy or girl. Wow. Realistically, this phone, if we're calling it that, probably shouldn't be on this list, but you know what? I thought it was funny. There are multiple generations too. They appear to be on the Kitty Buzz 3 now, and I do think the design, for what it's worth, has at least somewhat been refined. I guess I just don't really know if giving your kid even a limited smartphone like this is such a good idea, as you're basically training them to use smartphones from an early age, right? But then again, most kids now are practically inseparable from iPads the second they leave the womb, so maybe this isn't so bad. A basic controlled smartphone experience with some bare-bone features to keep your child satisfied and their grubby hands away from your own phone. Ugly or not, could be worse, right? Heck, I had a VTech V-Smile as a kid and that thing was sick, so who am I to judge? Best gaming console ever made, by the way. I don't want to see any comments saying otherwise. At number 6 from 2018, we have the Royal FlexPi, the first ever foldable smartphone available for general purchase. Yes, this phone beat the Galaxy Fold, take that Samsung. What makes this foldable distinct was the fact that when it folded closed, the screen was on the outside, rather than the more standard approach we're accustomed to, where the phone opens up into a larger display. On that type of device, you need another screen on the outside, whereas with this, you technically only need one. And well, it's pretty dang awful, honestly. Sure, the flexible display is impressive tech, but it just doesn't look right. You have this 7.8-inch 1440p AMOLED screen, not centered, with this big bezel on the side to house the cameras. And okay, sure, maybe, but the phone, it just looks unfinished, especially the hinge area where the phone actually folds over, and the phone doesn't even lie flat when it's closed, which probably doesn't make it very comfortable to actually use. That glossy plastic looks really cheap, the whole thing looks really cheap, outside of admittedly the very impressive display tech. This phone actually probably was unfinished, as it was rushed to market to officially be the world's first folding phone. Impressive, sure, and while there would be one more generation that did refine the design, it's better. Royal Technologies went bankrupt in 2024, so I wouldn't expect any more new generations coming out anytime soon, and maybe that's for the best. At number 5 from 2019, we have the Sharp Aquos R2 Compact, featuring not one, but two notches. This is getting out of hand, now there are two of them. Yeah, we've got a camera cutout on the top, very typical for a relatively cheap Android phone from 2019, but then one at the bottom for the fingerprint sensor. And man alive, does it just look wrong. It's funny because there's actually quite a few things to like here. We've got a 1080p 120Hz 5.2-inch display, Snapdragon 845 chip, and 4 gigs of RAM, all making for an impressive package in a relatively small form factor, hence the name compact. The back of the phone doesn't look too bad, maybe a bit boring, but you can't help but wonder why they didn't just put the fingerprint sensor back there, maybe on the power button. The first generation just had a big bottom bezel. I don't know, just do anything you possibly can to avoid having a second notch, because this thing is a monstrosity. Now, I actually do think there's a good few Androids from around 2018 to 2019 that could fit this list, if only for those awkwardly shaped notches and huge chins of the era. But frankly, there's too much selection from around that time to choose from. And yet, a phone like this still manages to stand out in a sea of general ugliness. It's not even like you have symmetrical bezels here. The chin is still thicker than like the sides and the top. What is even the point of all this? The Aquos R2 Compact would only be released in Japan. Very disappointing, I know. And ultimately, I don't think too many people will argue this phone's very deserving position on this list. At number 4 from 2011, we have the Casio GZ1 Commando. I haven't included rugged phones to this point because it kind of feels like cheating, so you can probably consider this phone a stand-in for all the monstrosities we've seen over the years. But I do think this device specifically really just takes the cake as one of the ugliest ever made. First off, Casio makes phones? I thought they made watches. Well, apparently they did make a few phones. Not too many, but a few. And as far as rugged phones go, this one was seemingly pretty good at its job. It could absorb drops, spills, it met military standards for an 810 UMG certification, the typical stuff you might expect from a rugged phone like this. We even had 4G LTE, pretty good for 2011. Too bad it's really ugly. The red and black accents, the complicated and busy design, the screws. Why? Do you really need screws to somehow prove this is a rugged phone? What happens if I unscrew them? Does the phone come apart? Actually, yes, I found someone unscrewing the screws and it turns out that is how you take apart this phone. It's so ridiculous, it almost makes me love their inclusion. Now, I do think when this phone came out as an 11-year-old at the time, I would have probably thought this design was awesome, but I was also kind of a dumb 11-year-old, so I'm not gonna take that opinion too seriously. Overall, Casio, maybe just stick to watches. At number 3 from 2019, we have the Nokia 9 PureView, and it's far too many camera lenses that really just stare right into your soul. If you have trypophobia, this is definitely not the phone for you. Now personally, I don't, but I just still find this design really unsettling. It's almost hypnotic. It reminds me of like a spider or something. It's a freak of nature. Okay, so this phone is fairly well remembered for looking ridiculous, but it did have some level of hype behind it. I mean, you've got an array of 5 camera lenses, all 12 megapixels each. 2 of them were RGB, 3 monochrome. Sounds pretty fancy, right? Surely this thing must blow every other smartphone from the era out of the water for photography. Well, no, honestly, it was pretty unimpressive. Didn't really stand out from the competition at all, making this absurd setup on the back completely pointless. Yeah, sure, some cool features may be there, but like, the photos were definitely not on the same level as an iPhone or a Samsung at the time. I guess I can respect the lack of any camera bump, although it does make it easy to accidentally smudge the lenses with your fingers, I'd imagine. The phone looks kinda cheap to me, even with the glossy glass back and aluminum sides. On its own, the design outside of those cameras is mostly pretty fine. The front is nothing special, with chunky bezels surrounding a roughly 6-inch 1440p AMOLED screen, and there's an in-display fingerprint reader, which apparently was not very good at all. It's just sort of a generic looking phone, until you see that horror show that is the camera setup. I can't even really explain why I find it so unsettling. It's unnatural, it's wrong, it's pure evil incarnate, and more than anything else, it's just plain ugly. At number 2 from 2006, we have the Virgin Mobile Lobster 700 TV. Yes, this phone is really called the Lobster. Apparently, Virgin Mobile used to have a whole line of Lobster phones. Why were they called Lobster? Because it's cheerful, youth-oriented, and quirky, apparently. Alright, sure, why not, I guess. And I suppose this phone does kind of look like a lobster claw. Apparently it was also known as the HTC Monet, but I prefer the Lobster name to be honest. But anyways, Lobster 700 TV, as the name might imply, supported digital audio broadcast technology, allowing users to watch TV on their phone. Because the phone would need a DAB receiver for this, you've got that strange huge bump on the side, no doubt making it really uncomfortable and annoying to actually use the Windows Mobile 5 software. On the back of the phone, you've got the 1.3 megapixel camera, as well as that big TV word mark to really make sure you understand what this phone is capable of. And if you really forget, on the front there, on the side, you've got TV there again, a little red dot, for whatever reason. I feel like conceptually, this phone wasn't too crazy, as we were still in the age of broadcast television, rather than media streaming via the web. But in practice, this thing just wasn't great. There was always going to be a limited selection of channels, loading in a new channel apparently was kind of slow, and both sound and picture quality were middling at best. The TV service also wasn't offered for very long before it was shut down. After which, can you imagine using this phone as a smartphone, like how uncomfortable that would be in your hand? Oh, it also kind of looks ridiculous. You can't forget that part. In the very least, the Lobster 700 TV stands as one of the most uniquely built smartphones ever made, both in form and function. Even the name is pretty wild. Maybe putting it at number 2 is a little harsh given some of the atrocities we've come across so far. I mean, at least you don't have like 50 camera lenses on the back. But I do think the shape, coloring, and old Windows interface makes for a very unattractive package by today's standards. Don't get me wrong, I really want one, but I wouldn't want to use one, if you catch my drift. And finally, in first place from 2012, standing as the ugliest smartphone ever made in the history of the universe, we have the Tonino Lamborghini TL700, the ultimate crime against nature and the smartphone industry at large. But hey, it's assembled in Switzerland, so it's gotta be high quality. Look, I'm not gonna say whoever designed this phone should be locked away in prison, since that would obviously be an overreaction, but I'm also not saying that. You know, sometimes sacrifices just need to be made for the greater good. Special shout out to another Lamborghini phone from 2015, the 88 Tori. This phone definitely should be on this list, but I didn't want to include 2 Lamborghini phones, and the TL700 is a bit uglier in my opinion. There's actually more Lamborghini phones, almost all of which, if not all of which, could be on this list as well, but again, TL700, it wins. It's the worst. It's a phone that causes a genuine physical response for me when I see it. It's wrong. The crocodile leather backing, sapphire display, gold-plated stainless steel chassis, all for the incredible price of $2,800. With only 650 ever made, you'd have to be stupid not not to buy one. And hey, that unboxing experience seems at least pretty cool. Okay, the box is actually pretty neat. I don't mind the box, but the phone itself, maybe close the box. We don't need to look inside. The TL700 was an incredibly mediocre smartphone even by 2012 standards. We're looking at a 3.7-inch 480p display, 5-megapixel camera, and 4 gigabytes of internal storage, all capped off with Android 2.3 Gingerbread, which was already out of date by the time this phone was released. The design is an affront to all of smartphone kind. This unbelievably gaudy, busy mess. That crocodile skin is just, it's so unappealing. It almost makes me physically ill. It's not okay, man. Like, I'm not a vegan or anything, but crocodile, really? Like, of all the things, why? The front bezel is ridiculous and so unnecessary, but at least there's a dedicated SOS button on the side. Perfect for when someone sees you using a Lamborghini phone and tries to rob you at knife point. Luxury phones are a very niche, very absurd corner of the smartphone market that have seen a good few ugly entries over the years. The Vertu Signature Touch is an infamous example, costing around 11 grand from 2014, and it could have easily made this list had we not already talked about it in my weirdest ever smartphones video. But this TL700 is definitely uglier. It's just atrocious. There are seemingly multiple colors from what I've seen, and the silver one is not as horrible as the gold version, but they're all still awful. You gotta wonder how these sorts of devices come to be in the first place. Obviously, a company like Lamborghini doesn't need to worry about bad press, and making a phone that inevitably will be clowned on by the internet isn't going to hurt their bottom line. But at the same time, it's not as if they needed the money from selling these either. And again, this wasn't their last luxury smartphone by any means, so you'd have to imagine it was at least successful enough for them to keep trying it later on. This one was released in Russia originally, I believe later in Hong Kong as well. Again, only 650 of them exist, so how many of those were actually sold? Who's to say? Maybe all of them. It's certainly possible. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend 3 grand on this phone? We've seen a lot of ugly and or poorly designed smartphones today. And you know what? I think we can all safely agree. The crocodile-skinned Lamborghini TL700 is the perfect candidate to be considered the worst of the worst. And quite possibly the most hideous, grotesque, and straight up unpleasant smartphone ever built. I mean, sure, it doesn't have like 500 cameras on the back, but you know, it's not great. I think there's been a lot of controversial entries today. I know there's been some controversial entries today, but somehow I think most people will be okay with this phone in first place. I mean, just look at it. And so with that, we're right about done here. We've officially gone over the top 25 ugliest smartphones of all time. Wow, what a collectively productive use of time for all of us. No, but for real though, while some of these phones are ugly in the kind of like, oh, I sort of love it way, you know, like the Motorola V-Box, that thing's pretty awesome, or the Lobster 700 TV maybe. Some of these phones, man, they are just really ugly, like that TL700, ugh, or that Nokia 9 PureView, those cameras, I just can't, man, I just can't. I don't know why. Maybe I do have that phobia. I don't think I do. Should I talk to someone about that? Do you need to get that diagnosed? Agree with my rankings? Disagree? Make sure you leave a comment down below, and definitely include any phone you think should have made this list. Good chance I've already talked about it in a different video, but hey, maybe I haven't. Either way, you can see for yourself. Those other top 25 videos are linked in the description down below. Again, make sure you hit that like button, maybe subscribe if you haven't. You want to see some more of these top 25 lists, which are definitely totally healthy for my sanity. Seriously, these take way too much effort. Like, it's probably not worth doing, but I find it so fun just to research these obscure phones. I don't know why. Definitely come hit up our Discord server. We've got a great community over there. Thanks to them again for helping me out with some of the phones on this list. And yeah, without further ado, I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.